Thanks a lot for another opportunity to talk about the Red Stockings. I also spoke at last year's conference and am looking forward, like everybody, to doing one of these in person sometime. But my name is Greg Gajus. Along with Greg Rhodes and John Arardi, I'm the co-author of Baseball Revolutionaries, How the 1869 Red Stockings Rocked the Country and Made Baseball Famous. And this year is now the 151st anniversary of the 1870 Red Stockings, which in many ways are more interesting than the 1869 team. And everybody that follows, has read about the history of the early game knows the very common narrative about the 1870 Red Stockings is that the fans lost interest after horrors. They actually lost the game. But our research for the book shows that the story was much more nuanced than that. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit today. This photograph here is the only known photograph of the Red Stockings on a baseball field. There's a lot of studio shots and things like that. This was taken on May 31st of 1870 in Cleveland before a game with the Cleveland Forest Cities. So this illustration here is from what was the absolute peak of the 1869 Red Stockings, July 1st, 1869. The city gave them a 27-foot long trophy bat that weighed 1,600 pounds after their undefeated tour of the East in June of that year. And the 1869 Red Stockings were justifiably famous. They went 57-0. They played on both coasts. And in the words of John Thorne, they made baseball famous. And the team and the players were absolutely worshipped in Cincinnati. And at the end of the 1869 season, all of the regular players signed contracts for 1870 at the end of the season. So they kept the team together. And during the winter, Harry Wright worked the team hard in the gym. We have this letter that he sent to Chadwick that he has the players now in much better form than they were a year ago. They're working out. And I think when we go east this season, we will be able to play a game or games of ball that will keep up our reputation. But then Harry also noted that time will show, for baseball, as you know, is very uncertain. Harry Wright was a very wise man. But they started the year tying into Bruce's presentation. They actually traveled to New Orleans and played several games against the various clubs down there. One could consider that kind of almost one of the early spring trainings. The games weren't particularly competitive. The closest one, I think, was 26-7. And then after that, they returned home for some warm-up games before again heading east in June to play the best teams in the country. On June 13th, they played the New York Mutual, who they had beaten 4-2 in an epic defensive struggle the previous year. A 4-2 game in this era, as you guys all know, is a stunning display of defensive baseball. The Red Stockings had averaged 42 runs a game in 1869. But in this rematch with the Mutuals, they beat them very easily, won 16-3. It was their 81st straight win. But the next day, they took on the Brooklyn Atlantics. They had beaten them pretty easily in 1869. They had won 32-10. However, in 1870, the Atlantic pitcher was George Zetline, who was one of the best in the country, but he had missed the game in 1869. And the Red Stockings jumped out to an early 3-0 lead. The Atlantics came back and led 4-3 after 6. The Red Stockings scored 2 in the 7th, and the game was tied 5-5 after 8 innings. After the 9th, the Atlantics were more than willing to accept a tie, considering a tie against the mighty Red Stockings to be a great accomplishment. but Harry Wright insisted on playing the game out. The 10th inning was scoreless, and then the Red Stockings scored 2 in the top of the 11th, but the Atlantics came back and scored 3 in the bottom of the 11th. So this is a pretty epic game, and but it was the first loss for the Red Stockings. So there's obviously some parallels to Game 6 of the 1975 or 2011 World Series. This was promptly hailed as the new greatest game ever. The game against the Mutuals that they had won 4-2 the year before had been considered the greatest game ever. And the Brooklyn Daily Eagle described it as the most stubborn game ever. Here's a box score from the game. I know it's a little hard to read, but and they've been around forever. But for those fans that think pitch counts are a new phenomenon, check out the bottom of the box score. We have balls pitched. Asa Brainerd 283, George Zetland 268. Now I know they were both throwing underhand from 45 feet, but 283 pitches in a single game is still a pretty good day's work. The Reds continued to play well after that first loss. In fact, they won their next 15 games. Of note was the attendance was still good enough in July that the club decided to add some seating to Union grounds for later that season. So if the club was worried about the impact of that first loss on attendance, that is certainly a funny way to show it. But they did start to struggle some on the field. They blew a 8-run ninth inning lead to tie Rockford 16-16. They barely beat Harvard, who they had beaten 46-1 earlier in the season. And the press, which had obviously just praised them to the skies in 1869, began to criticize the team. And much of it was focused on Doug Allison, who was the catcher for the Red Stockings. And if you think Twitter is nasty, you should see some of the newspapers from 1870. I love the writing in this era as seen by some of these examples. As for Allison, he should be placed in right field where he would have nothing to do or be accommodated with a sofa while catching. His lazy antics are utterly without excuse, and he does not gain any credit by indulging them. That's from the Cincinnati Gazette. And a day later, the Cincinnati commercial chimed in, talking about Mr. Allison's organ of self-conceit has been terribly enlarged this season. The public expects work, no fine airs, and no exhibitions of crooked temper and exaggerated self-importance. Allison is not the best catcher in the country by several. Now, personally, I would have cut Doug just a little bit of slack. He was a catcher, and none of the protective equipment we are familiar with had been invented yet. And like everybody else, he did not use a glove. Allison settled in the Washington, D.C. area after he retired, and this post-career picture of his hands found its way into the collection of the National Museum of Health and Medicine. So Allison always referred to his injuries as monuments for work well done. And at the same time, the Red Stockings record was 42-1-1. So the press criticism may have been just a little bit overblown at that time. However, in August, a string of events that would have a much bigger impact on the Red Stockings than losing their first game. So the first, Aaron Champion and John Joyce were the president and secretary of the Cincinnati Baseball Club. And they had been the visionaries really behind the creation of an openly professional team. They had raised the money, they had expanded Union grounds, they had hired Harry Wright, and they had organized the team's tours. And on August 2nd, they both resigned. And it's not really clear why, although both claimed they needed to pay more attention to their day jobs. But with brewing criticism in the press, some simmering dissension on the team, and some decline in interest, maybe they decided to just leave on top. You know, perhaps they believed they had proved their point that professional baseball would work. In his wonderful new book, How Baseball Happened, Thomas Gilbert suggests that Champion wanted to take advantage of his prominent role with the Red Stockings to run for political office. And Joyce was glad to help his friend and also protect his own interests in the numbers racket. And Champion did, in fact, run for prosecuting attorney in the fall, although he did lose the election. A gentleman by the name of APC Bonte became the new club president, but the real killer occurred a week later. George Wright was the biggest star in baseball, a fantastic hitter and acrobatic fielder. If you take Mike Trout's offense and have him play shortstop with Javi Baez's defense and flair, you'd have a pretty good idea of George Wright, the player. And as you could see, he was just an incredible hitter. But on August 9th against the Troy Haymakers, George tried to steal second and suffered a severe knee injury. It was probably a torn ACL. The Red Stockings won the game 34-8, but they lost the best player in the country. And George would not return to play until October, and even then he would usually play in the outfield or first base, and courtesy runners would run for him when he batted. The Red Stockings were 48-2-1 at this point, but without their biggest star, the team went downhill fast. And then on August 26th, the Red Stockings boarded a riverboat to go to Portsmouth for a game against the Riversides. They had beaten them 32-3 in late May. This turned out to be one of the craziest games in Red Stockings history. Their defense was very sloppy that day, and Asa Brainerd was hit pretty hard. Going into the bottom of the ninth, the Riversides led 27-23, and those 27 runs would be the most that the Red Stockings gave up in a game that entire year. Cal McVeigh and Charlie Gould were quickly retired, so there was 1 out to go in what would have been a huge upset of the Red Stockings. There was an error followed by a couple of singles. There was a fly ball to left, and it looked like another error, but the umpire ruled a catch for the third out. Harry Wright appealed the play, and of course they did what you would do in the 19th century. They asked the Riverside's outfielder, a gentleman by the name of Huddleston, did you catch the ball? And he admitted he did not. So that extended the inning. There was another single, and then Charlie Sweezy hit a walk-off grand slam for a 6-run rally with 2 out and no one on for a very improbable 29-27 walk-off win. On the boat ride back to Cincinnati, though, Sweezy and some of his teammates apparently got a hold of some alcohol, and some fights broke out. It's rather unclear whether the scuffle was among the players, the other passengers, the crew, or all of the above. And Harry Wright and the club had a lot of rules, expecting the players to behave as gentlemen, and in particular to abstain from alcohol. That was written into their contracts. And 2 factions had really developed on the team. The rule followers, which were the Wrights, Charlie Gould and Cal McVeigh, and let's just say the players that could be considered the rule breakers, led by Charlie Sweezy and Asa Brainerd. And certainly this incident was a sign of increasing team dissension. And the club executive board promptly expelled Charlie Sweezy from the team. And here was the note that they put out on August 29th that Charlie Sweezy be expelled from the 9 and his contract be declared forfeited. It is the determination of the board that the 9 shall be purged of all intemperate, insubordinate, and disorderly members. Sweezy apologized. The team had several crucial games coming up. George Wright was still hurt, and Sweezy was one of the better players on the team. So 1 day later, the board issued another statement, basically reinstating Charlie Sweezy to the team. He's given him every insurance possible, and his future contract shall be in every respect above reproach. And this passage of this resolution may favorably affect the position of Charles J. Sweeney as a man and citizen, and therefore it is resolved he is reinstated as a member of the first nine. All of one day later. And then on September 7th, the Red Stockings played the Chicago White Stockings in Cincinnati. And this was one of the most anticipated games of the year. In 1869, Chicago did not have a competitive team, but after seeing the success of the Red Stockings, a local group raised $18,000 to recruit a team with the express purpose of beating the Red Stockings. And like the Red Stockings, they were recruited from the East. And this ad appeared in the New York Clipper in the fall of 1869 saying, "We're looking for a team. Let us know what you need to come play." And the ad was answered by a gentleman named Jimmy Wood, who's seen in this picture here of the 1870 Chicago team. And he was a longtime player with the Brooklyn Eckfords. He was hired as the captain, and according to Wood, he had been recommended to the Chicago club organizers by no less than Harry Wright himself. And the game, the way he approached the game and the way Harry Wright approached the game set up an interesting philosophical contrast. Wood focused on recruiting hitters. Harry Wright liked hitting, but he was obsessed with preventing runs. And one of the big edges the Red Stockings had in 1869 is Harry Wright had pretty much invented team defense and baseball fundamentals. And regardless, you know what a Chicago-Cincinnati baseball game means. It means Cubs fans. Well, they didn't become the Cubs until 1903, but a large contingent made the 14-hour rail trip to Cincinnati for the game. Wood had intentionally scheduled the games against the Red Stockings for later in the year to give his team time to come together. And at the time of the game, the White Stockings were 47-8, and the Red Stockings were 52-2-1. The game was billed as Chicago versus Cincinnati, which is kind of the start of sports teams as city representatives. And the cities were commercial rivals. In 1860, Cincinnati had been the seventh largest city in the country and 43% larger than Chicago. But a decade later, in 1870, Chicago nearly tripled in size and was now the fifth largest city in the U.S. Cincinnati was still growing, but nowhere near the rate that Chicago was. George Wright was still unable to play, which also narrowed the gap between the two clubs. And the White Stockings jumped off to a quick lead. They led 3-0 after 2 innings and stretched the lead to 8-1. A late comeback closed the gap to 10-6, but the Red Stockings lost. 5 weeks later, there was a rematch in Chicago. 15,000 fans turned out. George Wright played, but he was still hobbled by his knee injury. This game was closer. The Reds jumped out to a 5-1 lead, while the Red Stockings chipped away. It was 8-8 after 8 innings, and then the Red Stockings defense collapsed, and the White Stockings scored 8 in the ninth to take a 16-8 lead. The Red Stockings rallied for 5 of their own, but could not complete the comeback. Final score: Chicago 16, Cincinnati 13. And the Chicago papers greatly enjoyed gloating about it, as you can see this clip from the report from the first game. You know, when the Garden City sets out to do a thing, she does it. And it took money to get the job done, and we did it anyway, and it was done. The Chicago Times noted Cincinnati was patriotic in the late ball match. On the field, they were red and white, and in the crowd, blue. And the Chicago Tribune said, "We are glad to note that Cincinnati exhibits some growth, for we feared the census would show a falling off in population as well as in hogs and baseball." So stay classy, Chicago. But in our minds, the 2 losses to Chicago is what buried the Red Stockings. Despite a better overall record, they could not even claim they were the best team in the West. And with all the buildup for these games, the losses devastated local fan support for the team. Now, one of the many flaws of the National Association was there's no clear way of determining a champion. technically, if you beat the current champion in 2 out of 3 games, you would be the champion until someone else took it from you. And there were 5 teams that were the best professional teams in 1870. And if you look at all their official games, the Red Stockings had the best record. They were 67-6-1. White Stockings were 65-8. The Philadelphia Athletic 65-11, and so on with the Mutuals and the Brooklyn Atlantic. But even if you narrow it down to, okay, how did they do in only their games against professional teams? Red Stockings still had the best record. And then if you look even how these top 5 teams played against each other, actually the Philadelphia Athletic did best in the games against the toughest competition. So it was really totally unclear who the champion was. There was a final game on November 1st between the Chicago White Stockings and the New York Mutual that ended in some degree of controversy. Chicago led 7-5 after 8. The Mutual scored 8 runs in the 9th and seemed poised to win, but the White Stockings, added by several questionable walks, had closed the gap to 13-12 in the bottom of the 9th when the Mutuals walked off the field in protest. So depending on who you ask is kind of who the champion was for 1870. In Cincinnati, the focus was really on whether the Wrights and the team would be back the next year. And in another big change from 1869, the new president of the Cincinnati Baseball Club publicly criticized Harry and George Wright, noting that the Wrights were paid well and that they were good players beyond a doubt, but the papers had been so loud and extravagant in their praise that, to be frank, their heads are turned. And they seem to consider we cannot get along without them. I have the greatest respect for both of them as men, but I don't consider them above criticism as players.
Hey, Greg, we got 3 minutes before Q&A.
Okay, just about there.
Yep.
Thank you. So on November 21st, the CBC issued a statement. And they said the experience of the past 2 years has taught us that a 9 whose aggregate salaries exceed $6,000 or $8,000 cannot, even with the strictest economy, be self-sustaining. They also said, we are also satisfied that payment of large salaries causes jealousy and leads to extravagance and dissipation on the part of the players, which is injurious to them, and it is also destructive of that subordination and good feeling necessary to the success of a 9. And for the reasons herein stated, we've resolved to hire no players for the coming season. This may have been the first time that ownership complained about how much ball players were paid. It would not be the last. And the club decided to return to amateur playing. The clean living faction, consisting of the Wrights, Charlie Gould, Cal McVeigh, went to Boston, and they became the core of the Boston Red Stockings, which dominated the new Professional National Association. The rule breaker faction went to Washington, and of them, only Andy Leonard played for Harry Wright again, joining Boston in 1872. In the end, I would submit that the Red Stockings were the victim of their own success. They established that there was a demand for baseball played at the highest level, and that demand increased the salaries of skilled players until the reserve clause was adopted in 1879. After years of investment in the team and the grounds, the CBBC felt they could not compete. And they had been smart to lock up their team before the 1870 season, but by the end of the season, the salary structure had gotten away from what they thought they could afford. And yes, they have lost and attendance did decline, but it wasn't the epic loss to the Atlantic. It was the injury to George Wright, the losses to their regional rival, and the dissension on and off the field that did the team in. So the club walked away, and Cincinnati would not have a professional team until the founding of the National League in 1876. And the team that is a true descendant of the current Red Stockings was the 1882 entry in the new American Association. But the Red Stockings had turned the game from a regional entertainment to a national pastime and had made baseball famous. A little more than a century later, Cincinnati would again, for a few years, be on top of the baseball world. And the Red Stockings legacy is still remembered fondly in Cincinnati. On May 4th, 2019, the 150th anniversary of the first 1869 game, the Reds dedicated what may be the finest monument to any baseball team, featuring 12 large busts honoring the 10 players of the 1869 roster, plus Aaron Champion and John Joyce, the visionaries behind the Red Stockings. Several descendants of the team attended the ceremony. And this is the book, Baseball Revolutionaries, still available on Amazon and in Kindle. And with that, I'll take any questions.
So Greg, I have one.
Sure.
I had heard that for the 1871 season, they allowed runners to go past first base instead of having to stop on it because of an injury to George Wright. But it sounds like his injury happened at second base, not because he had to come up stopping on first base.
Right. Yeah, I've heard the same thing though about that rule change, and yeah, that you could see where it would be pretty easy to injure yourself stopping at first.
But it probably wasn't George Wright since he hurt himself at second, is what you said.
That is true. It was a stolen base attempt.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? Well, thanks very much. Hope you enjoyed it.